Oh, hey everyone, it's Brad Thorpe, and welcome to another episode of Zero Velocity Podcast. So today, we're going to talk about isometrics for strength. And why is that important? Well, you guys saw me just like flexing my bicep there, right? I haven't lifted weights in 5 years. I do isometrics pretty much every day. And for a 47-year-old guy, I'm going to say, hey, that's not that bad. I'm sure there's better, but I only care about myself and my own physicality. And what we care about is you and helping you guys live a pain-free, high-performing, active lifestyle. So, what is strength? Do you guys even know? Well, when you do a quick little Google search, you'll find all kinds of different types of strength, whether it's reactive strength, explosive strength, maximum strength, ballistic strength, all this other stuff. But what we're just going to do is going to simplify it today. And we're just going to talk about muscle strength. And really not all the crazy sport lingo jargon stuff that basically just really kind of relates to velocity, like how fast that muscle contracts, how you reach peak force. We're not really going to talk about that today because we can talk about that ad nauseum in a different episode related to sport performance. So today what we're going to do is we're just basically going to talk about strength. And what it is, it's the capacity to basically withstand great levels of force and pressure. So that's it. So that's going to be our governing principle today when we sort of sit here and talk. Now, we are going to talk about isometric strength. So the ability to generate force and withstand force and pressure without moving. Now, there's a bunch of people out there who will discuss isometrics and say that, well, in a muscle contraction, even in an isometric scenario, you're going to have some oscillation within that muscle tissue. Absolutely. It's factual. It's scientifically proven. There's about a 16% change in muscle length. Also a 16% change in tendon length. So what they traditionally say that there has been no change in the total distance of what's called the musculotendinous junction, and not musculotendinous junction, muscular tendinous complex. So the combination of all of that. So what it is, there's a subtraction in muscle length and there's an elongation of the tendon, so equaling a zero change. And more specifically, there has been no change in the actual joint position from a visual perspective. Microscopically, most likely the joint moves. We just don't see that. So if I'm sitting here contracting my muscle, this would be considered an isometric muscle contraction. If I go down, that would be, well, a concentric or an eccentric, depending on which joint I was looking at, as well as where was the direction of force. But traditionally, we look at up as concentric, down as eccentric, and staying still as isometric. So we are talking today about staying still. Why is that important? Well, most of you sitting here are staying still. Most of you sleeping, right? So you basically walk around all day stacked. When you sleep, most people side lie, and now you have forces going across your body. They're traditionally called shear force. And what you end up doing in the morning when you wake up, you just go, oh, I just don't feel good. You know, so we're going to help you resolve a bunch of those issues, whether it's muscle pain, whether it's poor physical performance, all through what we discussed today, provided you listen and you execute on the information that we give you. So what is isometrics? We just went over that. It's learning how to contract muscles without movement. Traditionally, if you read about it, you have yielding and the other one. I can never remember them. And the reason for that is because I don't talk about whether I'm holding a load in space or pushing basically an immovable object, right? So you got yielding and overcoming. There, I remembered it. Now it's kind of cool. So if I'm holding, that would be yielding. If I'm pushing down, that would be overcoming. Cool. We got that out of the way. Let's put that over there in the memory bank. Unfortunately, it doesn't work for me in my memory bank. But anyways, have you guys heard this before? Isometric strength is the fastest and safest way for developing muscle strength. They have been saying that line for decades. Now, the problem, they always follow it up with this stupid little caveat. Yes, a stupid little caveat, because they put it in there to make you think it's not important. They state, great, isometrics is the fastest and safest way to develop muscle strength, but it's only good for a specific joint angle. You guys ever heard that? I hear it every time I discuss isometrics, either in a class format, in a peer-to-peer setting, or oftentimes with people that know nothing about isometrics, because they've heard that before. Now, the interesting thing is, and we're just going to pull this up, just so you don't think I make stuff up, right? Everything that comes out of my mouth is supported by science. If you want the studies, email me, brad@isophit.com. Happy to send you the studies, so that way you guys can get educated on it. So here it is. So at a specific joint angle, yeah, it's good for that specific joint angle. But there's also a 30% gain in strength. So 30 degrees of a joint angle. So not just only one angle, it's 30 degrees, right? They also will add, it might be plus 15 or degrees, 5 degrees, something like that. But here we go. So let's pull that up again. So after 6 weeks of isometric training at one angle, we're at L, so the guys who studied this way back in 1995, and this was a continuation of research, found a significant increase in strength at 52 or 0.52 rads, which is the equivalent to 30 degrees from the training angle. So that's pretty cool. Now, the problem is they only studied one joint angle. So if I'm doing this exercise and I'm holding, well, what about my hips? What about my knees? What about all my spinal segments? What about my elbows and shoulders? So if I'm getting significant muscle strength at 30 degrees around every single joint that's working isometrically in your body, think about how magnificent that would be. How efficient and how effective that would be. Now, if we jump down to a little bit more science, right? So what I'm going to do, so I'm just going to pull this up. My suggestion to you guys is to train more joint angles. And I don't even need to make this up from a science perspective. So here's a cool thing. So after 9 weeks of training, the increase in isokinetic strength, so it's a comparison between weightlifting and isometrics. And what they found was after 9 weeks of training, the increase in isokinetic strength was similar in both legs. So pooled data from 3 velocities. Okay, so what they mean is I'm doing one leg isometrically at multiple joint positions along a way. And the other one I'm just doing like dynamic exercises at different speeds. So I got this one versus here, 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 and here. So what they found was the dynamically trained leg increased basically, okay, let me just try to read this again. So after 9 weeks of training, the increase in isokinetic strength was similar in both legs. Pooled data from 3 velocities, dynamically trained legs, 10.7, and the isometrically trained leg was 10.5. So nearly identical. Right? So the dynamically trained leg versus the isometrically trained leg. The isometrically trained leg increased in dynamic strength, basically on par, it was 0.2 off, as the dynamically leg trained. Now here's where it gets interesting. So when you looked at the isometric strength increase, was significantly greater for the isometrically trained leg, right, than the dynamically trained leg. The dynamically trained leg increased 13.1%. Sure, it's not bad, but the isometrically trained leg increased 18%. So you're doing a lot better with the isometrically trained leg. So you get the added benefit of, when doing multiple joint positions, you get the benefit of dynamic increases in strength as well as increases in isometric strength in both dynamic as well as isometrically trained legs. The difference is you get more isometric strength and dynamic strength with isometric training, making it more effective and more efficient. Now, it goes on to say this may have been due to the greater absolute torque involved in the isometric strength training and the residual angle specificity effect, despite that isometric training being divided over 4 angles. And what they're kind of meaning and insinuating is if I train at a specific angle, I'm going to get really strong. And there is that carryover effect that they're trying to talk about, where you have that 30 degrees. So if I get strong here, let's say that's at 90 degrees of knee flexion. Let's go with, we're going backwards, so 60 degrees of knee flexion, 30 degrees of knee flexion, and 0 degrees of knee flexion. I'm going to get freakish strong. And when you combine all those different isometric components, it equals increases in dynamic performance. So that's from science, that's not my opinion, that's taken from this study, and it's kind of look at it factually. Now, here's where it gets interesting. So what some of the studies have noticed, it kind of sucks to be 30. You want to know why it sucks to be 30? Because you start losing your ability to generate isometric strength at 30 years of age. So the majority of you out there who are listening and watching are probably over the age of 30. You're probably experiencing some level of discomfort, joint pain, mobility deficits, and a lot of that comes back to the fact that you've lost your ability to stay still. Now, the interesting thing is when we look at isometrics and compare it to dynamic exercise, the goal of isometrics is to create strength and stability. The goal of dynamic exercise is really to go between position A and position B, and then back to A. So it doesn't really matter what the goal is. Now, if you happen to be doing cardio, it's just basically go, and it's all A to wherever your end mark is. Now, the interesting thing is, well, if I get strong and stable, do you not think that that's going to transfer over to that dynamic world? Well, we've already looked at a specific study that sort of indicates that it does. We just have to do more than one angle. Now, if I'm looking at isometrics for my shoulder complex, well, maybe if I did one at 0 degrees, like 0 horizontal abduction, so basically straight out, and just did different angles. Maybe if I did 6 angles, well, if we know 6 times 30 it happens to be 180, maybe I don't have to go through full range exercises if I have maybe a shoulder issue. Maybe I can start doing some isometrics to have greater levels of strength. So then if I choose to do dynamic exercise, I'm stronger and more stable and better prepared for it. So one of the things that they started to notice with this sort of study was when you turn 30 years old, you start to get weaker. And it was spread across not just one muscle, it was spread across 3 different muscles that they looked at. And they looked at back strength, arm strength, and leg strength. And it's kind of like, well, that pretty much is global, so it's obviously my upper body, my back, and my legs. So if they start getting weaker, mobility is going to become a little bit more suspect. One reason isometric strength may drop off is because you're just simply not training it. We've already seen that if you do dynamic exercise, your isometric strength component is going to be less than it could be. It could be that. It could also be the fact that at about the age of 28 years old, the majority of humans reach peak height and then start to shrink. So that is one thing that we also have to consider, that the tissues we're talking about are inherently getting looser. So that would mean that we need to ramp up our isometric force generation in order to best hold our joint structures together. So that way, when we go to move, we're held together properly, and then motion can create in an effective and efficient manner. Because if we're loose, mobility goes down. Efficiency goes down. It's kind of like if you were to loosen the bolts on your car and then ask basically go drive in it. The performance is going to be impaired. So one of the things that we also can look at is, we'll pull up this study here, and this is basically from Muscle, Ligaments, and Tendon Journals, and it goes back to 2013. So this is after 30 years of age. So we start to lose muscle mass. We have muscle mass and strength loss. So the aging process, and this relates people, they measured this stuff at 30 and they started to look at people when they were a little bit older at 40 and beyond. So the aging process leads to a distinct muscle mass and strength loss. The decline of this muscle and the muscle strength for people who were younger than 40 years in comparison to those who were older than 40 ranged between 16 and 40, well 16.6 and 40.9%. Can you imagine losing 16 to 40% of your muscle strength and expect to function the same, to not be in pain? Gives you something to think about. Now, the interesting thing is, what if I told you that in 84 minutes of isometric exercise, you could add 10% muscle mass and increase your strength isometrically by 54.7%. That is over 14 weeks and 6 minutes a week, right? So a study, and I'll just pull that one up just because I like the slide, right? So if we make that big, because this dude looks jacked and we like looking at him. So the results showed an increase in quadriceps size by 10% and an increase in isometric strength by an average of 54.7% with just 6 minutes of committed isometric strength training per week over a 14-week period. So that's 6 minutes a week for 14 weeks. That is 4 times 30 seconds of exercise per week. That's it, right? So you start to look at that and you go, well, what are you guys doing that you can't get these benefits? So it gets kind of interesting when you start to look at these results. Now, one of the things that we have to sort of explore is what happens when you get a little bit older when it comes to maximizing your force output with age. So we just saw that we can increase it by your muscle mass by 10%. We saw that we can increase basically your strength by 54%. Now, this next study I'm going to pull up basically looks at aging and its relationship of isometric torque production. And torque is basically a rotational force, and it's the potential to create movement and high force scenarios. In that world, what we have to look at is the fact that in an isometric world with aging, it's about strength and stability. And if you guys have watched older people, what happens to their mobility? They tend to regress. Their range of motion becomes decreased. They have a hard time holding still. They start to shake a whole bunch. And we see that when we start to look at the science. We see that aging leads not only to muscle loss, as well as isometric strength loss. Now, the interesting thing is, this next study points out to the fact that you have more isometric strength loss as you age than you do have dynamic strength loss. And that gets really kind of interesting. So what we'll do is we'll just pull this up. And this is related to your knee joint and looking at your quadricep function and your hamstring function. So you guys can all see there that you have the youngest group, and if you look at that top sort of, 2 little points on that graph, you can sort of see that you have your knee extensor muscle strength, and then you have, on the bottom side, you have your knee flexor muscle strength.
The top part of that is the little what do you call those, like a little triangle or chevron that indicates muscle isometric strength, and on the bottom you have your isokinetic strength, dynamic strength for simplicity's sake. And what you'll see in every area, your ability to generate isometric strength is greater. And that's pretty much for all humans, unless you have some sort of specific condition that I'm unaware of. And going through the aging process, what they found was going between the ages of 20, and it's actually 86 if you guys go back and look at the study. The average loss of isometric torque production between the ages of 20 and 85 over the given three ranges was basically 73 foot-pounds of torque, or 1,010 kilogram per centimeter of torque. Now, the average loss for the isokinetic torque was 707 kilograms per centimeter, or 51 foot-pounds of torque. So if you have the ability to rectify this stuff relatively quickly through the addition of isometric strength training, why not add it? I'm not here to say that dynamic exercise is bad, but what I am here to say is it's less effective for a number of things. One being the creation of strength, as well as the creation of stability. And if those two things are important in your life, adding isometric strength training is going to alter your future health outcomes for a number of things. Now, it gets pretty interesting. So one of the reasons when we look at this, why? Well, isometrics increases the activation rate of muscle tissue better than eccentrics and concentric muscle training. So if a muscle is more active, neurologically speaking, there's a high probability it's going to be more effective at generating force output. Now, it's more encompassing when you're looking at an isometric muscle contraction as well, because other muscles have to work isometrically to generate force to hold yourself in position. So if you're looking at this and going, it's between 95 and 100% more, the isometrics is 95.2 through 100% activation rate. Eccentrics and concentrics was roughly 86 and 87% respectively. So you're getting a 14% greater yield in less time. So if I can increase that muscle strength in less time, making it once again more efficient, why wouldn't I explore that? Now, it gets really interesting. So I'm a massive fan of Eddie Hall. So we're going to call this section Efficiency and Effectiveness versus Eddie Hall. And if you guys don't know who Eddie Hall is, he's known as the Beast in the world of basically strongman competition. He is the first human to lift half a ton. And he did this a couple of years ago, and he set the world record. It's subsequently been broken over the last year. But anyways, so Eddie Hall deadlifts 1,102.3 pounds at a body weight of 407 pounds. And the reason I bring this up, and I want you guys to hold on to that number, 1,102 pounds. That is monumental. Like, you can look at that. The guy near died after lifting that. He had to go to the hospital, nosebleed, passed out, all these wonderful things. Now, there's a study done back in 2012, and what they looked at was the different ranges of a deadlift. So they had basically the floor, so deadlifting off the floor, the knee, the mid-thigh, and lockout. Now, traditionally, everyone is now jumping on the mid-thigh isometric deadlift and how it relates to athletic performance. So good for you guys, you're doing a great job, but we also need to discuss other joint angles and other exercises when looking at athletic performance. So one thing I want to point out, remember that 1,102.3 pounds. So Eddie Hall was 407 pounds. So in this study, they got a bunch of guys who had a 1 repetition maximum of 555 pounds. So that's almost half of what Eddie Hall lifted. They had an average body weight of 244 pounds. So they're significantly less than Eddie Hall by basically, what's my math on that, 160 pounds less, and they lift half as much as Eddie did at this time for their 1RM. Now it gets kind of interesting when you start looking at your peak force. So they give all these little numbers. So they go 300 or 3,380, and that's newtons. So let's not talk newtons because nobody knows what that is. Sorry, very few people. So what they're really saying is off the floor, these guys are able to generate, in order to create movement of 555 pounds. They come up with 759.85 pounds on the average. So they're already training 204 pounds heavier than what they were doing dynamically in an isometric perspective. So if your goal is to get strong, like really freaking strong, let's not talk about I want to be good at the skill of lifting a whole bunch of weight, like a deadlift. But if I want to get really, really, really strong, what do you think is going to make you stronger? Lifting 555 pounds or trying to lift 759 pounds consistently? Now, when those guys are lifting that 555, a traditional deadlift might only take 3 or 4 seconds if you're going slow. So these guys have the ability to work on these ranges and generate these significant amounts of force output. Now, if we look at the next position, which is the knee, they're up to 920 pounds of force generation, which is like, okay, that's cool. They only lift 550, but now they're training at 920. So do you not think there's going to be more stimulus to the tissue to get stronger and most likely bigger? If we jump down mid to thigh, this is where it gets really, really, really amazing. Eddie only did 1102.3. So the mid to thigh position, they're lifting 1,310.4 pounds on average. So that's over 200 pounds heavier than Eddie. Now remember, they're 160 pounds lighter and half as strong, generating more than what Eddie pulls. I'm not saying Eddie can't pull 4,000 pounds. Wouldn't that make Eddie stronger? Something to think about. Maybe it gets rid of those risky points throughout a range if I start specifically training these ranges. Now, when I get to the lockout position, it goes down to 1,103. So they're basically lifting the same as what Eddie was at lockout. Or not lifting, generating that same level of force output. Now, why do I bring this up? Because I want you guys to take some of this knowledge, explore it, research it, contact me, ask me to help clarify if you have questions. We can explore this stuff at a greater level of depth. We are trying to keep Zero Velocity Podcast to the masses. And what we're able to see, as we showed you earlier, in 14 weeks, doing 6 minutes of isometric strength training, we can increase muscle strength by 54.7%. We can increase that mass by 10%. Now, what I do recommend, I recommend you doing that isometric training for 30 minutes a week, not just 6. So your strength levels may go up significantly greater in less time. I know myself, and this is anecdotal, when I was dynamically lifting, and I'm not structurally built to do a great deadlift, my maximum deadlift was usually about 315 pounds. And that's when I was like in my 30s and late 20s, when I was lifting all the time. Now at 47 years of age, without basically deadlift training at all, in basically half a decade,
I can comfortably walk down and lift 385 pounds. And I feel quite good with that. I don't have muscle or joint pain, which is lovely, which I had all the time when I was doing a bunch of my dynamic lifting. And that's specific to me. But the majority of people I talk to when they start getting out of their 30s, one of the common things we discuss is pain. We are able to resolve pain with isometric-based exercise. It's effective and efficient, and the reason for that is you increase the contractility of muscle tissue, it holds you better together. Remember, we're getting looser with age. So that's one of the reasons when you're looking at increasing the natural tone of muscle tissue, which once again is phrased differently, is an isometric muscle contraction. So I just want to thank you guys for joining me today. I want to thank our sponsors, Zenkai Sports, Kinvent, and Isophit. I want to thank my team at Isophit Media for putting this together. Thank you everybody. And we'll see you guys next time on Zero Velocity Podcast.